What is up, YouTube family? Thank you guys for tuning back into Wilburn Shenanigans. My name is Chad. This is my wife,
D.
And we're back with another exciting, funny, great. I don't know if this is funny. Serious. This is gonna be a serious video, I think. We reacted to the song the group Molotov, and they were talking about like the Mexicans and talking about how they're being called and dealing with the racism in that song and the stuff they deal with, which got to us. And this one, man, I don't really like subjects like I don't want to say that. I don't want to say I don't like. It's disturbing to me, like to watch stuff like this. I know it's a part of our history, but I have two grandmas. One's still alive, one not. My dad's mom is not alive anymore, but she's from Texas. And she didn't really share a lot of detailed stories, but she told me like what they lived through, like back then. And then I have a grandma that's still alive on my mom's side, who is older. I won't say her age, but she's old. But she's from Louisiana, and she has stories. And she's not even the oldest of her siblings. My great aunts have also, shared stories about them living on the plantation, picking stuff, and it's saddening. It's saddening, because they say get rid of this history. Like, let's forget about it. Don't talk about it. And it's crazy because it's like you can't say that because they say the saying is, oh, your generation didn't have to live through it. But I have a grandma that's alive that did. I have great aunts that are alive that did. I have great uncles that are alive that did. So it's like I can't not forget about it because their history is a part of me. So this video definitely is going to be one that's probably real touchy. So the title of this is Facts About Slavery Never Mentioned. And I've talked to D about this because, when you go to the history book and we're taught in school, you got all this history. You got this thick book that's probably, let's just say 300 pages long. 5 pages of that is black history. And we get Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and some slavery. That's it. Now Emmett Till's starting to come up. You get that now. But as far as like stories about what slavery was really, it's a quick segment. You mean a 400, 500 page book, and you get this much. Mm-hmm. Black history lasts for how long? Slavery lasts for how long? And this is all we get. But yeah, this is probably it's gonna get crazy. But it's educational. Let's learn. Let's see what they're talking about. It was a must watch. Everybody's talking about must watch. We're here. So. Expert is taken from a book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. Untold Facts About Slavery.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race.
So now hearing that, which I have heard this before, about other enslaving. The only fact that bothers me about this in today's world is when they bring up that it's like okay, they try to erase the fact that blacks, African Americans were brought from their territory to America to become slaves. I get it, but I feel like they try to make it heavier. Be like, well, black people enslaved black people, so that don't make a wrong and a wrong don't make it right. You know what I'm saying? You can't. Do they just do it? So monkey see, monkey do is what y'all told me. That's why I'm like, when you say that, it's okay, I get it. It was a part, but don't try to make it seem like that was the biggest issue. Blacks had slaves too. We know that, but the lynchings and the burnings and the killings and all that great stuff that was done by
race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, The Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million.
Jesus.
The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by." This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making. Despite
You know, it's crazy now that they bring that up. They're talking about Roots. Like another conversation. Me and D talk a lot of outside of like all this. We talk about a lot of stuff that goes on in the world. It's so crazy that he brings up Roots and talking about like giving the people the idea of like how it was. You know, it was just, what did I just see? What they were talking about. It's crazy. They said the pictures. They were talking about pictures. Like there's pictures and there's a book out there that I can't think what the title is of the book. I can't remember what I was talking about, but there's pictures out there that's showing you the people that are around and celebrating lynchings and blacks being burned and stuff like that. And the thing that they came up with is the reason why these images, we don't see them or they're not talked about a lot or brought up a lot or anything like that, because they're afraid that people of today's world are going to see their grandparents or great-great-grandparents in those photos and celebrating the lynching of African American. And they're saying like, that's why we're keeping this stuff away, because you might be like, oh, that's my, hey, I'm on that photo. Like, I mean, how would that make you feel? Like, unless you're on the same feeling as her and not liking blacks, but, or whatever race. And I feel like that, I never knew that. Like, they said there's so many hidden pictures out there that's just like, no, they're not going to release them and you're not going to see them because you're going to see a party of people celebrating lynchings and all this good stuff.
But at that point, that just goes to show you, like, no, it wasn't that long ago.
It wasn't.
Like, when people are like, oh, that was that many years ago. It was that long ago.
Slavery.
No, it wasn't, because literally, that explains it right there. They're not showing them because it can be your family.
Slavery was about, what, 65? And even if it was, come on now, you guys are alive today to know when bills and everything is passed, it don't go in effect right then and there. Like, it don't take effect the next day. Like, just because it passed don't mean everybody's mind change. If I didn't like you yesterday, don't mean because they signed the bill and said, hey, I'm going to like you today. Like, that don't change people's mindset. That's the part people forgot. Like, they think because they passed it and freed people and stuff like that, that people's minds the next day said, you know what, I now like black people. No, they still stay in their mindset and say, I don't like you. Just because they passed it, I still don't like you. I still cannot stand you. That's what it comes down to. But back to this history lesson.
Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year.
What?
By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia. In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu.
You know what's crazy listening to this too? And I'm gonna go to the African side. Me and my dad, he's big on talking about stuff like this too. And it makes me think when I hear about, the blacks enslaving blacks on the weaker blacks, it makes me think of that thing. And I know my people, and you might say it in your if you're from a different ethnicity, but we call it thing a generational curse. I don't know if anybody ever heard that term. If you have, it makes me think like we think of these generational curses as like, oh, this stuff has been going on. Black hate has been going on since this time 1800s. He said 18. You're talking them enslaving each other, and then like modern times today, we still have this amongst our communities. Gangs like blacks not liking each other because of a territory. And
or not even that, but like when their life is better than their other ones.
But look at it. This is territory.
Yeah.
Like they're fighting. It's like that's the generational. Like, is that the curse that need to be broken?
Yeah.
Because it was going on there. This is blacks and blacks saying like, okay, you weaker
in different places,
and I'm about to take over your territory.
Yeah.
It's crazy. That is crazy.
Two in Rwanda, the Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
So that answered my question. I didn't even know that's what...
I feel like I learned so much more in this than I did in school.
Right. I didn't even know. That's what I was curious about when it ended. Like, how did this all, like, what was protecting the people?
This might sound like a dumb question, and I know you guys be on me, but whatever. So technically, that's technically trafficking. So trafficking has been going on for years now. And people are barely saying, like, oh, trafficking started. Like, no, like, y'all technically trafficked people back then, seen it, didn't change it, and now they're doing it still to this day. Still, like, that's crazy.
I wonder...
That's sad.
I wonder what... Like, the question becomes, like, what, like the for me, is when they talk about the black slave owners, I wonder if they were, like, fearful to the point, like, I gotta have
like
some
they
slaves.
have to fit in.
Yeah, I gotta have some slaves or I'm gonna be a slave.
Yeah.
Like...
But, and it's like, at that point, I feel like... I always tell him, like, if that was the case, then I feel like so many blacks should have became slave owners to get all the slaves and then treat them better, not the same. Because there was those black slave owners that literally treated them like they were white. And I'm like, what? Or other races, whatever. But still, it's like...
It's crazy, though. I didn't even know the other, like, Asians and all them was enslaving their own.
Like I said,
I never knew that.
I feel like I've learned so much in this clip than I did in history classes.
I never knew that.
All of them that I've taken.
That's crazy.
That's mind blowing. And that's the thing. Like, we don't know it all. Like, there's still stuff that we don't know, and we're learning as we get older. We're almost 30, and look, we just found stuff out at our age, and it's like, it's that true saying, like, you learn something new every day, and it's like, it's that.
It's crazy. Like I said, this is like, for me, it's always been like a touchy subject. You know, knowing my family are from those places, like Louisiana and Texas is my root. Well, I'm not from there. My parents, that's their back roots. And when you hear this stuff, like, my dad told me stories about him being in high school and stuff like that, and like, he's not even that old. Like, that's the part I always tell people when they say, like, oh, times have changed. My dad's 58. Yeah, 58, right? And he has stories in high school. So when I look at another 58-year-old walking around, I say, you lived through those times with my dad. What side of the fence were you on? Is the question I tell her all the time. What side of the fence was he on? And there are some that changed and forgotten, but there's some that hasn't. They still don't care. So it ain't too far back that this stuff... It's a
hit and miss, honestly.
It ain't too far back this stuff didn't take place. Like, that's the thing people ain't getting. and want to erase it. It ain't no erasing it. There's some people that can't even erase it out of their mind because they embedding it in their children. Like, they're training their children to be exactly like this.
Or
there was
like
just a whole U-Haul arrested of people a hate crime. Yep. They were getting ready to go commit a hate crime.
They were gonna go to... And
they released their photos today. They just released all their photos.
Oh, wow. And they were gonna go shoot up a...
Like, it still goes on, and it's just like, it's just swept. But it's crazy. I mean, this is crazy.
I mean, there's people out there that do your stuff for you, like bankers, cashiers, securities that are like that still. And you have to deal with that.
Crazy. But let us know what you guys thought about this video. What you guys
no judgment zone.
Did you learn anything? And what's your take on this? We definitely want to know. This is definitely something different for us on this channel, but have to dive in. Can't be afraid. Got to dive in and learn stuff and do it and just do it. But thank you guys for tuning back in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share. We'll see you guys in our next video.